On a rainy night in the era before cell phones, I was 18 years old, walking a very long way home from work. I foolishly accepted a ride home from a strange man. Small town girl living in her lonely world, and I had just gotten off a double shift. He was elderly and acted genuinely concerned for me. I also saw a Bible in the back seat. Probably safe, right? The car was old and broken down. He had to get out to open the door for me. It took him a while, as he had trouble walking with that bum leg of his. He told me the passenger door didn't open from the inside. I immediately felt weird, but years of nice girl training told me he's gone to so much trouble already, you can't say no now. We chatted for a while and he politely complimented my uniform, my hair, and told me I looked a lot like his late wife, that her spirit must have led him to help me get home. It sounded very sweet in the moment. The conversation turned if I was in school, what my hobbies were, and gradually turned to whether or not I was on my period. This was rude, but he acted like it was going to be the punchline of a joke or something. I laughingly asked him why he would even want to know. He told me very calmly, "Because if you're fertile, we should start trying for a family right away, right?" Oh shit. He said that God had kept him lonely for so many years now, but because I looked so much like his late wife, it was clear I was meant to be his. He could now start life over again and finally have lots of children like his wife was unable to do. He grabbed my hand firmly and kissed it. "I can't wait to show you to our new bed." I told him I forgot something at work. He told me I could go get it tomorrow. I told him I needed to pee. He said it could wait until we got home. He was not going to let me out now. He kept talking about how things were different back then. Men are the head of the household, and women are to follow their fathers and husbands no matter what. God says this, God says that. He talked about his wedding day and how his wife's father had given her to him. I blurted out he was going to have to get my father's permission to marry me before taking me home, right? God would want that after all. You need to do that, because otherwise we would be living in sin and the marriage bed would not be holy. Luckily, I had remembered that from my many days of church sermons. He got really offended then, said he knew the Bible far better than I ever would, and of course he knew to ask my father for permission. Well, I told him we couldn't exactly live together in sin. We should go to my house instead before going home. I reminded him the street was not very far away. I was still trying to keep the conversation light and joking. I kept pushing him. That's what a godly man would do after all. He now wholeheartedly agreed. We got to the street where I had previously told him I lived. He asked which house was my parents'. I gave him a fake house number, far away from my actual house, and had him drop me off there. He wanted to come inside. I told him I needed to let my parents know about God sending me a husband before he could meet them. I said it would take a few days. Come back tomorrow. He told me, "I'll give you a few minutes, but then we need to be on our way." I told him to drive around the block so I could at least have time to pack my clothes. He nodded and finally opened the car door. I ran to that house's door and waved to him until he drove away. Then I sprinted over to my house, where I lived alone. I double-bolted my door and put the couch in front of it that night. I never saw that man again either. I did not call the police, though I wish I had. I moved in with my boyfriend a few days later, and I insisted on waiting at work from then on until he could pick me up every night. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe he was trying to be nice, but every red flag was raised, and every alarm inside me was going crazy. This happened just a few hours ago, and I'm safe now. I don't think I have anything else to worry about. You see, I'm going to another country to see a band I love. I found a cheap Airbnb online and booked it. I was supposed to come in last night, but the flight was delayed. My train was also missed. It was a nightmare trip all in all. I was supposed to get to this place after midnight. The owner told me that was totally fine. I checked the reviews about him and all of them said he was a lovely host and actually very nice. I noticed though that every single one of these reviews had all been written within the last few weeks. Red flag number 1. At this point, I missed the final train and was unable to get to the place that night. I told him I couldn't make it, but I would be there tomorrow. He said that was okay. I got to the train station of the city I'm in, and I decided to walk because I didn't have that much cash with me. I walked for about 40 minutes and got to a place that could be called run down at the very best. I saw drug dealers everywhere. You could just tell sometimes, you know. The door, which had the right number on it, was just a white door next to a shop. Red flag 2, 3, and 4. I had never been able to get a hold of him after. I had his number, but it would always go to an answering machine, and he didn't answer any of my texts either. I walked into that shop and asked if someone lived there. The guy in this shady-ass shop said, "A few? Who are you looking for?" I told him my host's name. He was playing with his phone in a way I couldn't see anything of what he was doing. Instantly, I got a message from my host. He says he's almost there. I leave the shop and realize that was red flag number 5. A half an hour later, this guy came up in a car with a girl in the front seat. "Hi there, I'm your host. It's the wrong address on the side actually. Hop in the back and I'll take you there." At this point, I just said, "You know what, thank you, but I'll find somewhere else to stay." After that, I walked away. I don't really know what was going on with all that, but it was very, very suspicious. This happened just a couple of months ago, so I'm still quite on edge from the experience. I had a group of friends that lived about an hour and a half away from me. I would very frequently go and hang out with them. The drive never really bothered me too much, but after this particular night, I started to really dread it. I first noticed the car following me about 20 minutes into my trip home. It was about 2 a.m., so not many cars were on the road at that time. This guy was practically riding my bumper. I thought this was really strange, because obviously there were no other cars out. There was a whole lot of room. I wrote it off though and tuned back into my music. The time on the freeway was about 55 minutes. He was directly behind me for the entirety of it. When I noticed him getting off at the exact same exit as me, I began to get a little bit anxious. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. I was heading home as I normally would, until I noticed that this car was also making every turn right behind me. At this point, I started to turn down random roads to test my theory of this person following me. Just as I suspected, they were trailing behind me exactly. I stopped going towards my house at this point and started driving randomly, trying to think of what I could do in this situation. I tried whipping down roads at the last second, but that didn't work. I was driving through red lights and stop signs. I was scared of what he would do if I stopped. I was desperate at this point. I called the police and told them I was being followed for over an hour. I gave them a description of the car and my location as well. The dispatcher told me to drive to the police station and there would be officers waiting in the parking lot. As soon as I turned into it, the car sped off immediately. One of the police cruisers immediately flipped their lights on and followed them. I stayed at the station and gave my statement, but I never got a call or anything like that. After that night, I only drive during the day now. I don't know what would have happened if I were to just go straight home. Update. I followed up with the police station. The officer I spoke to said he wouldn't get into detail, but there was a lot of meth found in the man's car, along with a lot of sharp weapons as well. He's now in jail, and I definitely needed that peace of mind. This happened to me this past Friday night. I, 30 and female, work at a bar on weekends, about a mile away from my house. In nice weather, I like to walk the commute. It's a quiet residential area. The halfway point between my house and work is a park with a basketball court and adjacent baseball field. Usually I won't walk both to and from work in the same day. Instead, I'll take an Uber at least one way. The time and days I walk home vary as well. This is all for context. This night, I left work at around 12:30 a.m. About 2 blocks away from it, I heard someone walking behind me now. At first, I thought it was one of the guys I work with. We've crossed paths on the walk home before, since we're somewhat neighbors. When I turn around to look though, no, it's a young guy, maybe my age at most. He's on the other side of the street, about a block behind me. The man now started singing. At first, I thought it was no big deal. Maybe he wanted to make sure he didn't sneak up on me and startle me. But the singing started to get kind of eerie. It was starting to make my hair on my neck rise. I started to pay attention and tried to hear for clues of mental instability or any direct communication to me. I was about a block from the sports field, and this person was getting slowly closer and closer, now maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I realized at this point that the houses just past the fields were kind of unkempt. I'd never seen anyone outside even during the day, aka no one would be around to help me if I needed it. I decided it was getting way too creepy. I abruptly turned around and started walking the same way I'd come from. The guy kept walking his same direction. I didn't look back more than once to confirm. I waited on a corner for 2 or 3 minutes, debating if I should call an Uber, return to the bar, or just keep on walking. I'd already texted a coworker who was still there that I was being followed, sketched out, and to be worried if I didn't send a text upon my arrival home. Like any good horror movie though, I stubbornly decided to keep walking home along my original route. The Uber was 7 minutes away and $10 for a half-mile trip anyway. Plus, I'd be a complete sitting duck waiting for it. I didn't want to walk the half-mile back to the bar when my house was the exact same distance either. I was ultimately and finally swayed by the fact I'd had a real rough shift at work, and the walk always unwinded me. It was a dumb choice, and clearly the wrong one, but that's how I arrived at it. As I soldiered on, I turned onto the street with the basketball court and field. In the parking lot, there was this tiny compact car, the kind you might refer to as a clown car. It was pulling out of the lot. A car was approaching, so it was waiting directly in my path. As I slowed down, my gut was saying not to get too close. Eventually, it pulled out and turned in the direction I was headed, but went straight instead of turning where I would be heading. I sighed in relief. I noticed a sharp smell as I passed by the parking lot, almost like dry leaves, earthy but unidentifiable. I just chalked it up to my conscience being on high alert. I turned onto the upcoming street, which was the final stretch of dark residential area before I reached the almost home safer leg of the trip. I tripped over the curb and chided myself for looking vulnerable for even a moment. I then paused to regain my composure. There was a U-Haul truck parked about 100 feet ahead of me on the opposite side of the street. As I looked up from tripping, I could see 2 figures now emerging from behind the truck. They were in identical all-black outfits, weird black pilgrim-esque hats, and what I thought to be clown masks. My first thought was, oh fuck, I'm fucked. I thought of that weird clown thing that happened a few years ago. After a moment, I realized the masks were all white though, so either Michael Myers or Jason masks. This was somehow a relief. Clowns would have had me so terrified I'd have frozen up. Something about the way these guys were moving toward me was extra eerie too. Outfits aside, my body was screaming to get out of there. Without speaking to each other or me, they began walking diagonally across the street right towards me. They never even turned to communicate with one another. Immediately, I did a 180 and started power walking. I was already holding my phone as a precaution from that first guy, so I FaceTime my roommate. She doesn't pick up. I called the cook, the guy I thought the first guy was. He picks up on the second ring. "Where are you? I need help. I'm being followed." I was in a complete panic. He climbed into his car and said he'd be there in 2 minutes. For some reason, the call now dropped. I was now by the fields, and I realized they were again crossing the street, getting even closer to me. I called him back and told him to stay on the line this time because I was not okay. It had to be obvious I was now terrified. The abrupt change of direction, the phone calls, the looking over my shoulder. The park is a great place to smoke. It was almost Halloween as well. I turned into the street where the singer had followed me and paused. The house on the corner of the park was my #1 pick if I had to end up banging on the door for help. They were always outside working on their cars, and the property is well maintained. Their windows are within 10 feet of the sidewalk. Just kinda gave off good Samaritan vibes, you know. A stark contrast to the surrounding houses I'd never seen anyone in. My friend pulled up to the corner within 2 minutes of my first call. A miracle. I ran and hopped in, tears starting to slow from the adrenaline release. We started driving back along my original path. Those guys were still there, now standing in the basketball court's parking lot, mask still on, not moving, seemingly waiting for me. They watched us as we drove away. I got home, locked my door, and did my best to calm down before going to bed. Obviously, I did not sleep very well. I called my dad the next day to share my story. He thought the first guy could have been a scout. The sharp smell could have been from either or something. He insisted I talk to the police. I worked again that night, but slightly traumatized. I got a ride in. I couldn't bear to walk that path even in broad daylight now. I stopped at the police station after work and gave them a play-by-play, but only of the 2 masked creeps. The first singing guy seemed kinda like a stretch to connect to them, and the cops were looking slightly skeptical as well. The one asking me for details finally turned to the other officer next to him and asked him to start his patrol at the park that night. They were polite but unfazed, didn't even take my name or anything. The last creepy bit was finally heading home that night. It was exactly the same time, 12:30. A friend was giving me a ride, and we decided to take the same route and see if anything seemed off. That same clown car was parked in the basketball court parking lot. My friend suggested pulling over, half kidding, but I insisted we not even try to fuck around with that. This happened 2 years ago. Typical normal day in my suburban neighborhood. My wife asked me to run to the grocery store for something. It was around 2 or 3 p.m. When she asked me, I was sitting in the dining room, which was right next to the garage. Instead of walking to the front door and then all the way around to the front of my house to my car in the driveway, instead I just went out the door next to me that led into the garage. I hit the button to open the garage door, and it started to rise. I walked over and ducked to walk out before it was finished rising. I stopped dead in my tracks when I realized there were 2 people standing right in front of me in my driveway. A very overweight man and a very overweight woman. This caught me totally off guard. I probably muttered some type of hello, then asked if I could help them with something. Before I had time to focus on their response though, I noticed the woman wasn't looking at me like the man was. She was holding a fake baby in her arms, cradling it and telling it to shush. This left me flabbergasted. I immediately assumed they, or at least she, might be mentally disabled. I looked over to the man. Without missing a beat, he asked me if I could give them a ride to the store. I made up some excuse why I couldn't take them, even though that's where I was going. The man's face immediately turned red. The woman never even looked up at me. I walked around them and got in my car. I locked it, hit the garage door opener on my visor, and then called my wife. Meanwhile, the man was glaring at me through the windshield. I told my wife what was going on, and to make sure all the doors and windows were locked just in case. Before backing out of my driveway, I waited for the 2 people to start walking away. Eventually, they did. I asked my wife if she wanted me to stay instead. She wasn't worried though. She told me it was fine. She'd still like me to go and get what she needed. The grocery store was only a couple miles away from my house. I grabbed the item, paid, and left as quickly as possible, still kind of worried about that strange encounter I'd had. As I was driving back home, I saw the 2 people walking down the sidewalk toward me. The woman was still looking down. The man saw me again and got very obviously upset, then walked out into the middle of the road in front of me. I could tell he was trying to say something, but instead I drove around him and continued home. My wife called the non-emergency number, and they told us they'd send an available officer to the area to drive around and take a look. I never saw them again. I have no idea if they were going house to house asking for a ride or what. A part of me feels bad thinking they both might have been mentally disabled and just wanted a ride to the store, but the whole encounter was just too bizarre. If they hadn't surprised and spooked me the way they did, I may have given their request more consideration. I'm a 17-year-old guy currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail. I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you post stuff on the internet, whether it's a good trail, an abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it may be. People come flocking over, usually with a lot of trash and very loud music. Anyway, this particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon. Pretty simple in and out overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancel on his part left me on my own. So, with a packed bag and car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Not leaving the house on time and some trouble navigating rough forest roads, I didn't arrive to the trailhead until around 5:45. For those of you who don't backpack, this is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast. I figured though if I moved quick enough, I could get at least 2 or 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own, with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was and being all on my own. Eventually it got so dark, I could only see where my headlamp was pointing. That's when I figured I needed to stop and get a camp set up, with only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast. I ended up in a less than ideal spot. There were some burnt pieces of wood and remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before. Definitely not recently though. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dried wood. I got the fire going. I got my tarp set up as well and cracked open a can of chili mac I had brought for myself. I was very much looking forward to eating it. I was feeling good, my camp was set up, my food was on the fire. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike had almost gone away, but it was still there. To fully understand what happened, I have to explain to you how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing, surrounded by large pine trees with a trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything on the edge of that circle and past it are pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire, eating my dinner, when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I looked at that tiny rock in shock. I was positive I was the only person on the trail that night. I immediately turned my light on and towards the area where I had seen the rock come from. Due to the density of the pines and brush though, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 10 to 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me, searching for whatever or whoever had thrown that rock. I didn't dare to stray far from my fire. In hindsight, it offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock or it had fallen from a tree or something. I went to sleep that night, not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke to the sound of rustling leaves, barely audible if you weren't listening for them. They were there though. Still in a sleepy haze, I listened as the rustling of leaves got harder to hear. I assumed this must be moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I had fallen asleep. The more I looked though, the more scared I got. I realized it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of my tarp and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my life where I must have almost shit my pants. The flashlight I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now away from me past the tree line out in the woods. I hurriedly slipped on my boots, clutching my knife in my other hand, and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options. Stay here and wait out the night, or attempt the 3-mile hike back in the car in the dark. I figured whatever or whoever was out there was definitely gonna have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light. I decided to stay at the camp and wait out the night there. Eventually, whatever it was came back. I could hear it walking through the woods. It was far off, but I could still hear. It sounded like someone walking slowly by, like they were on a gentle stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes it would walk far away and I would lose the sound of the steps altogether. An hour later, maybe 2, it would return, fainter than ever. This went on for about 3 or 4 hours until I listened as the steps got closer and closer. They were about 7 feet away from me. At this point, the fire had gotten very small as I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped and everything went totally silent. Clutching a knife in my hand and prayed I would not hear anything further. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed up my things and speed walked the 3 miles back down the trail I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked and sprinted to it. As I unlocked my Subaru, I jumped in and drove, and didn't stop until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly to see or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I was able to read what was written in the dust on the back window of my car. Sleep well. A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and scariest by far, so I thought I'd share it. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can.